Test 1, 2. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Maritime Administration's 2022 Port Infrastructure Development Program, or PIDP. How to apply for a Port Infrastructure Development Grant under the FY2022 Appropriations Act webcast. My name is Jonathan Holt. I am a Management and Program Analyst in MARAD's Office of Port Infrastructure Development, and I will be the moderator for today's call. During the presentation, we ask that if you have questions, please send them to pidpgrants@dot.gov, and you'll see that at the bottom of a number of slides as we go through the presentation. But again, that is pidpgrants maradad@dot.gov. This email address also serves to answer technical support related questions if you experience them while trying to access today's presentation. When the presentation is concluded, our panelists will address as many of your questions as possible, and today's webcast is being recorded. After the webcast, the presentation will be available on the program website, which is www.maritime.dot.gov/PIDP grants. So starting our presentation today will be Mr. Peter Simons, a supervisory transportation specialist with MARAD's Office of Port Infrastructure Development. He's going to provide an overview of the program and delineate the differences in funding between the two pools of available funds for the 2022 program. So, for a brief introduction, the 2022 PIDP program will provide federal assistance to improve facilities within or outside of and directly related to operations of at or an intermodal connection to coastal seaports, inland river ports, and Great Lakes ports. I will now hand it over to Peter Simons to begin and continue on with the overview.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. For planning purposes, we likely will not go the full 2 hours. We're going to review the slides, and this slide presentation is based on the slides that were shared during the initial How to Apply webinar. But what we've done is modify the slides to highlight new information in red. In addition to addressing changes to the program by virtue of the Consolidated Appropriations Act for 2022, or what I'll just refer to as the Appropriations Act, I'll also highlight as we go through the slides points or areas where we've received kind of a multiple questions in the PIDP grants inbox, just to try to share the information we've shared with individual requesters with a larger audience. And at the end, there are a couple of frequently asked questions that we're getting pretty consistently, and so we wanted to address that as well as part of this presentation. So first, you'll see on the left-hand side of this screen, as we indicated in early March, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, appropriated $450 million for the fiscal year 22 program. The Consolidated Appropriations Act for this year, which was passed by Congress and signed into law last month, appropriates an additional $234,310,000 for the fiscal year 22 program. Under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, there's no specific set aside for coastal seaports or Great Lakes ports, but as you'll see on the second bullet on the right-hand side, under the Appropriations Act, Congress has directed that no less than $209 million of the money it appropriated for fiscal year 22 be made available for coastal seaports or Great Lakes ports projects. No minimum grant size under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, but the minimum grant award under the Consolidated Appropriations Act is $1 million. And finally, probably the most, the final significant difference here between the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is that there's a provision that the cost effectiveness determination for projects does not apply to projects located in non-contiguous states or territories. And we'll get into this in a little bit, but would note that applicants seeking funding for small projects at small ports that are located in non-contiguous states or territories are still subject to the economic vitality analysis. So this summary slide may bring up a question about how do I figure out, which source of funds I should be applying for, and we want to try to make it as easy as possible for applicants. So we will consider a project for funding under both sources of funding if the project qualifies, or if it only qualifies under one or the other, we will consider it based upon the evaluations for that particular source of funding. And as you'll see, when we talk about project eligibility and eligible applicants, there are no changes out of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. So as a result, you don't need to worry about whether or not you would qualify under this source of funding or not. We will consider each project as comprehensively as possible for funding under one or both of the sources of appropriation for the fiscal year 22 program. One other thing I should note is that we are working on an amendment to the Notice of Funding Opportunity that will be posted to grants.gov. It will be posted on the program website. And if you're on our email distribution list, we will also send you a notice when that amendment is posted, and we'll provide on the Port Infrastructure Development Program website a brief synopsis of the changes in the program as a result of the Appropriations Act, the 22 Appropriations Act. So kind of now proceeding to the slides that, again, were part of the original How to Apply webinar. You'll see the significant difference here is that the total amount of money available for fiscal year 22 for port projects under PIDP is $684 million. That actually then results in an increase in the set aside for small projects at small ports of 100. The amount today is 171 million for small projects at small ports. I do want to highlight here the statutory purpose of the program, and we've kind of reflected that in most of the responses to the questions we received from PIDP grants at dot.gov, and that is that you need to make sure that you tie all of your projects to the overarching statutory purpose for the Port Infrastructure Development Program, again, as reflected here, and it's also in the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So to emphasize a point from the second slide, so there's no minimum award size under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, but under the Appropriations Act, the minimum award amount will be $1 million. By virtue of the increase in the amount of funding, a maximum now of 171 million can be awarded for projects in any one state. We talked about the increase in the amount of monies set aside for small projects at small ports. No more than 10% of that can be used for small projects at small ports for development phase activities. We will limit the award to small project at small ports to no more than 11.25 million. So that figure does not change from the original Notice of Funding Opportunity and presentation. And for funds other than the reservation for small projects at small ports, no more than 51 million is maybe awarded for development phase activities. So think planning grants, etc. Assuming that, of course, that those projects don't result in construction as part of the PIDP application. No change here, but do want to emphasize the first bullet. The goal is to obligate funds no later than September 30th, 2025. And again, obligation occurs upon execution of a written grant agreement between the Maritime Administration and the grantee. So the concept of obligation is very important, and we'll see that in a couple of slides throughout the presentation. As I mentioned before, no change in terms of eligible applicants or the guidance with respect to joint applications. We have had a number of questions related to joint applications, and so I just want to emphasize the last bullet on the slide, that Unlike last year, joint applications must include a memorandum of understanding as an attachment to the application narrative, and there's further information on this in the notice of funding opportunity, but that memorandum of understanding has to be signed by all the entities that are involved in the project and needs to include a description of the roles and responsibilities of each of those entities. No change here in terms of guidance on cost sharing or matching responsibilities. And also, most importantly, no change in terms of the types of eligible projects. I do want to emphasize that the bullet 4H there, electric vehicle charging or hydrogen refueling infrastructure or other related port activities. So that is shortened from the full description of project eligibilities that are set forth in the notice of funding opportunity. So again, want to draw your attention to that distinction. But most importantly, no changes in eligibility as a result of the Appropriations Act. Also, no additions to the types of projects that would be ineligible for funding. I do want to emphasize the last bullet. Applicants who propose projects that include cargo handling, automated cargo handling equipment need to provide the information that's outlined in that cited section of the notice of funding opportunity. Again, that's information related to helping us make the determination about whether or not the equipment would result in the net loss of good jobs or reduction in the quality of jobs within the port or port terminal. But this type of equipment is not necessarily ineligible. The issue is whether or not the particular fully automated cargo handling equipment item would result in a reduction in jobs, and that's why I want to emphasize in the last bullet that we're looking for you to help us provide the information that is necessary by virtue of the language in the National Defense Authorization Act. No change here in terms of the ability to seek funding from multiple components. And again, just a reminder about the definitions that are set forth in section A4 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. I want to emphasize here that applications will still be due by midnight Eastern time on Monday, May 16th. At this point, hopefully everybody has gotten their grants.gov and related registrations. The other thing we wanted to emphasize is that some applicants have asked if, in addition to the standard Form 424, in the project narrative as reflected in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, there are other documents that have to be submitted. And the answer is that there is not, although we strongly encourage you to submit the SF424C, the budget information for construction programs. That will help if you are selected for award. That will help in terms of developing the grant agreement between MARAD and the selected applicant. And again, there is a suggested order of attachments that is listed in footnote 12 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. You don't need to follow that guidance. It does help reviewers in terms of being able to find information as part of the technical review of your application. So this has not changed. Again, a suggested list about how to organize the project narrative. I do want to emphasize that we are updating the chart that is located on pages 24 and 25 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And we just are basically asking two additional questions. Are you applying as a small project at a small port? And then also, is the project in a non-contiguous state or territory? Other than that, none of the information on this slide has changed. This slide also remains the same. I want to emphasize, and we will talk about this on the last slide, that if the applicant intends to request DOT approval to expend funds between the date of the grant award announcements and the date of obligation, which again is the date of the grant agreement with the selected applicant, that information needs to be reflected in the budget narrative. And again, more information on that is in the notice of funding opportunity. No change to the information on this slide, but do want to emphasize to encourage you to tie your project to one or more of these project categories. And there's more information about each of these in pages 29 through 33 of the notice of funding opportunity. But if, for example, you're proposing to purchase equipment may have an applicability to one category, or if it's, let's say, low emissions or no emissions equipment, it may have an applicability to more than one category. And so an applicant should make sure to tie their proposed project to at least one of the project categories identified on this slide. So this, of course, talks about what an applicant should include for a benefit cost analysis, and that element of economic vitality is, of course, applicable to large projects. Do want to emphasize here that applicants who are seeking funding for projects located in non-contiguous states don't necessarily need to submit a benefit cost analysis, because again, in the Appropriations Act, the cost effectiveness determination is waived for projects in non-contiguous states and overseas territories if they are awarded funding under the Appropriations Act. But there is an advantage to applicants in submitting the benefit cost analysis, because if a project is found cost effective, then the project would be eligible for funding both under the bipartisan infrastructure law, the $450 million funding that was provided by Congress in the fall of last year, and the Appropriations Act funding provided by Congress last month. Again, these are the three elements that, from a small project at small port standpoint, the economic vitality analysis will consider. And I want to emphasize that this applies to all small projects at small ports, even those in non-contiguous states and overseas territories. So no change really to the next couple of slides. With respect to project readiness, a number of questions regarding how an applicant, if selected for an award, could accelerate its post-award, the process for coming to a grant agreement. And so one element from an environmental perspective is to reach out to the MARAD's Office of Environmental Compliance to discuss the current status of your project. That's reflected in more detail in the notice of funding opportunity. And so just want to emphasize, to the extent that you do that as part of your application development, you would definitely want to highlight that in the narrative. So we'll talk a little bit more about domestic preference at the end of the presentation. I did want to emphasize that this year an application needs to include a discussion of what it is you have done to ensure that the project will comply with the domestic preference requirements. So it's not just that we will comply, but how do you know that you will comply? And as we talked about in the initial How to Apply webinar, for example, perhaps you've done a market analysis, or you worked with a manufacturers association, and you've identified, as a result of one or more of those efforts, you've identified domestic preference sources of supply for the components that will be used as part of your project. You would want to demonstrate that, obviously, or describe that rather, as part of the application narrative. And the other consideration is you may have prior experience with a similar project, and as a result, you would have prior experience procuring the components associated with the project. So those are a couple of examples. But again, this year we are looking for you to discuss how it is that you can comply with the domestic preference requirements, and or steps that you would take to ensure compliance of the project with the domestic preference requirements. So again, just the major change here is the fact that the determination about a project being cost effective does not apply to projects in non-contiguous states or territories. And so if an applicant chooses to submit a benefit cost analysis, and this would be for a project in a non-contiguous state or territory, the benefit cost analysis, by virtue of the Department of Transportation independent assessment, results in a finding that the BC, the benefit cost ratio is less than 1. That will not be, that would not adversely affect the project's evaluation, and obviously would not be applicable to a finding that the project would be eligible for funding under the fiscal year 22 Appropriations Act. No change to how we will approach the application review process, or obviously the merit criteria. So this really kind of repeats the slide in section D, but from an evaluation standpoint, again, an applicant may want to consider whether or not they submit a BCA for a large project outside in a non-contiguous state or territory, but doing so, you're not required to do so, and doing so, particularly if a benefit cost ratio of less than 1 is the determination by the DOT reviewers, is not going to affect the project's eligibility for funding under the Appropriations Act. It obviously would make the project ineligible for funding under the bipartisan infrastructure law. No change to this slide, and as before, no change to the merit criteria or how we will evaluate merit criteria related to climate change, equity, leverage of funding, and project readiness. Again, we'll return to the issue of domestic preference in a moment. Finally, under the technical evaluation side, just again want to emphasize that the determination about cost effectiveness does not apply to projects in non-contiguous states or territories if they're awarded funding under the fiscal year 22 Appropriations Act. So no change to the guidance requesting regarding additional information. Again, this is all in sections F, G, and H of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Do want to emphasize, however, the second full bullet here, grants are reimbursement grants. And just to kind of go through this again, because they're on occasion, seems to continue to be some confusion about this. So once a project is selected for award, that's not authorization to begin performance. Rather, what we do is we reach out to you, have an initial kickoff meeting, and then work together to develop a grant agreement, which is based upon a template document provided to program staff. If the applicant wants to begin expending non-federal funds before grant agreement, there is a written pre-approval process that is necessary We will talk briefly about this at the next to last slide. But I do want to emphasize the pre-approval that is necessary before the applicant can begin spending its proposed match amounts. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, reimbursement takes place only after a grant agreement is in place. The applicant incurs allowable expenses, and they submit a valid request for reimbursement to the Maritime Administration. So while funds will not be made available to applicants upon award, rather it's a process of reimbursement, and only after a grant agreement is complete between the selected applicant, the awardee, and the Maritime Administration. No change to this, and I'll go through these last couple of slides only really very briefly. Because we talked about this before, but we do encourage you to present a project timeline that's realistic. You need to recognize that there are a number of key steps that have to take place between the selection of a project as part a grant award and then the actual completion of a grant agreement. For small projects at small ports, and encouragement to pay careful attention to the economic vitality analysis. Summarize the key points related to those three elements that were highlighted earlier and discussed in the notice of funding opportunity in your project narrative. We talked a little bit about technical readiness suggestions, particularly in terms of the kind of project design and engineering, but to the extent there's an element of or level of engineering that's taken place as part of project development, you will definitely want to emphasize that in the application narrative. Emphasizing again the overall statutory goal of the program, everything needs to be tied to that overall statutory goal. And then finally, one other thought here that's not reflected on this is reread the notice of funding opportunity. We recognize it's a pretty extensive document, but it is carefully written, provides a lot of detail and suggestions about how an applicant can make an application narrative more competitive. And so as you work on developing your application, it's worth referring and re-referring to that notice of funding opportunity. I do want to emphasize again that you have a series of, MARAD has a series of field representatives called Gateway Directors. They are a phenomenal resource, both in terms of their knowledge of the Maritime Administration and other Department of Transportation discretionary grant programs. But they can also help you craft and develop your narrative, or they can provide suggestions that program staff who are limited to kind of focusing on helping you interpret the notice of funding opportunity are not able to do. And information on the Gateway offices is located on the MARAD website, and you can link to that from our program website. So for the last two slides, I want to go over 4 questions that we have gotten pretty consistently. And so just kind of want to make sure that we all have kind of the same baseline of knowledge with respect to this. So the first one relates to, can grant funds be used to purchase equipment? And in general, they can. As you can see here, there are some key things to keep in mind. Again, as we emphasized earlier, tying the acquisition to the statutory purpose of the program, understanding that the equipment, both the acquisition and its life cycle, need to comply with the requirements and conditions in 2 CFR Part 200, including in particular Section 200.313. So, for example, while the applicant will get title to the equipment, there's a conditional title to the equipment. The Maritime Administration, as the last bullet indicates, retains an interest in the property until disposition occurs, and there is guidance on how the equipment may be used, what needs to be done from an accountability standpoint with respect to the equipment, and then when the equipment is no longer needed for the purpose for which it was purchased, the process for disposing of the equipment. The other issue I would want to emphasize with respect to equipment is we have gotten some questions regarding acquisition of used equipment, and that similarly would be eligible, but probably the most important issue there is to make sure that you understand that used equipment, like new equipment, is still subject to the domestic preference requirements. So it's not from whom the equipment is purchased, but rather it's the original source of the equipment itself that is key in terms of ensuring compliance with the domestic preference issues, particularly, well, for used equipment in that particular context. So the next question we've gotten frequently was, what's the timeline for making awards and for completing grant agreements? And it's it really depends upon a large number of factors. Probably the greatest will be the number of applications that we receive, because that's going to drive the timeline for our technical reviews. And as most people know, there are other discretionary grant programs who have deadlines. The raise, for example, closes today, I believe, or closed yesterday. The combined notice of funding opportunity solicitation from DOT will close a week after our application deadline. So all of that will obviously affect how quickly we can get through the technical review process. But in general, our goal is to make the awards this fall. And as we talked about during the first webinar, in general, we can get grant agreements completed within 6 to 12 months. The big factor there is kind of really how truly ready is the project to move towards the grant agreement stage. So, the spring 2023 to maybe fall 2023 is kind of a good timeline for estimating when a grant agreement might be completed between the Maritime Administration and a successful applicant. I do want to emphasize the significant variable here is what I'll call project readiness. And we do see applicants that understandably want to change the scope, perhaps the location of the project, or the schedule needs to be changed or adjusted, or the budget. Permit approvals, not just on the environmental side, although that's a principal issue, but the status of permit approvals is also a consideration here, as well as significantly NEPA completion, meaning NEPA completion that is satisfactory to the Maritime Administration. So as a general rule, some rough timelines there, but again, a lot of variables that will drive those potential dates. So there have been a number of questions regarding a provision in the bipartisan infrastructure law called the Build America, Buy America Act. But at the end of the day, the fundamental question is, are the grants still subject to Buy American requirements? And the answer is yes, although technically they're subject now to the provisions, again, in the Build America, Buy America Act section of the bipartisan infrastructure law. As reflected in the notice of funding opportunity, domestic preference compliance will be evaluated for all projects. And you'll see kind of an excerpt from the Build America, Buy America Act. Fundamentally, while details of the implementation of the act are still being worked out, for example, there is now a Made in America office, the Office of Management and Budget. All PIDP grant recipients should understand that they will be expected to meet the requirements of the Build America, Buy America Act. And so again, that takes us back to the earlier slide about what we are looking for in terms of domestic preference input in the narrative so that we can do an effective job of evaluating your application. And then finally, we alluded to this earlier. Some applicants have asked, some potential applicants have asked, will they be able to spend some of their match after award, but before completing a grant agreement? And so first and foremost, this is identified in the notice of funding opportunity. I do want to emphasize that when you're selected for an award, we'll discuss the process for approval of any proposed pre-grant agreement expenditures. And as a general matter, awardees will need to obtain approval prior to incurring any costs between grant award and the date of obligation or entering into to grant agreement. So at this point in the process, as an applicant, it's really kind of important to note a couple of things, and we identify them here on this slide. So in general, those costs would be limited to pre-construction activities unless there was an approved, unless the NEPA Act review had been completed. So think, planning activities, maybe additional engineering, etc., permitting related activities. The costs cannot be incurred or expended until you have received approval from the department. And again, we have a process in place for this now. The costs have to comply with all federal requirements. So if, for example, the cost relates to engineering, the engineering firm has to have been acquired in accordance with the guidelines for the program. For example, most importantly, Brooks Act and a fair and open competition process. And the costs, as reflected on an earlier slide, need to be identified in the grant application as future eligible expenses. And that's because this will make the approval process itself much faster if you've identified those costs up front. So that, very quickly, or perhaps not so quickly, is our updated how to apply webinar. Again, we will complete and then post on our website and on grants.gov the amended notice of funding opportunity. But with the information in this webinar, essentially applicants can continue to move forward with their applications. And again, a final reminder that the applications are due before midnight Eastern Time on Monday, May 16th. And with that, I will turn it back over to our moderator.
Thanks, Peter. All right, so we will now go through the questions we've received so far. Reminder, if you have any questions you haven't sent in yet, you can send it to the email listed at the bottom of the slide there, the PIDP grants@dot.gov. So we'll begin with our questions we've received. So the first one, the question asker is asking, for the location section of the narrative, are you interested in knowing whether a project benefits specific census tracts or whether the project is actually physically within? And they're referencing, the various opportunity zones or different types of census tracts. So I'll let one of our panelists take that question now.
For the purpose of the location section, we are looking for where the project is actually physically located. And obviously, projects may cross one or more, census tracts or opportunity zone areas. And in that case, we are looking for the applicant to describe in the narrative all of the applicable zones that the project is physically located within.
Thanks, Peter. All right, the next question is asking about things that you can include with your application. So is it okay to insert some maps and project layouts on an 11:17 format within the 30 pages, which is, of course, the maximum number for the narrative? so it's easier for the reviewers to see, or must all pages be 8.5 by 11?
So this is actually a helpful question, because what happens to your application is it ends up, when it comes in, it ends up getting scanned into a PDF file. And so I would say that with respect to the material in the 30 pages of the narrative, it's probably best to leave that in an 8.5 by 11 format. Although at the end of the day, you know, it will not obviously affect how we review your project. If you have drawings, for example, or detailed maps apparently like this that are best displayed in an 11 by 17 format, it might be best to include those as an attachment to the application narrative. But do want to emphasize, as kind of reflected on one of the slides earlier, that when you include material as an attachment to the narrative, do make a reference to it someplace in the narrative so we understand both its importance and kind of where that material rests with respect to the enclosures that are provided as part of the application package.
All right, thank you. The next question relates to the term obligation under the grant. So the questioner notes that the NOFO advises that they should identify any project expenses between grant award and between grant award announcement and obligation that we intend to spend, which would count toward non-federal cost share. So they're just, I think, Peter sounds like they're just wanting to have understand the definition of obligation under the grant.
And that's we definitely get this question often, and so I think we probably need to do a better job, you know, next year with the notice of funding opportunity. But by obligation, what we mean is the actual grant agreement between MARAD and the selected the awardee, and the term comes from the fact that when we enter into a grant agreement with you for a particular project, then the federal government obligates that money, ties that money, commits that money to your particular project. And so when we say obligation, what we really mean is the date of the grant agreement.
Okay. The next question is related to if someone is awarded the grant. So this says, if we are notified of an award on October 15th, 2022, when could a port start expending project funds and count it toward leverage funds? Would that be October 16th?
Right. So the short answer is no. In this case, we're looking at now a project, presumably not a small project at a small port, expending money again. That's part of its match. And remember, post award announcement, if you want to start expending money, the first step is to receive approval to spend that money. And so that's why, among other things, we ask that you identify that in the application narrative that highlights the issue for us. But again, we do have a process in place. And once an applicant that identifies or expresses an interest in taking advantage of that, we will send the awardee the information so that they can begin spending that money. But until they receive approval, the applicant or the port could not start spending its project funds and have it count towards the applicant match.
Okay. So the next question is asking if a port has an engineering or geotechnical bench or a selected consultant team that has been originally selected in a fair and open process, is that okay?
So I presume in this case that the questioner assumes that the selection of the engineering or geotechnical team complies with the federal requirements, and if that's the case, then yes, essentially that's okay. But what we always encourage applicants to do, or entities considering application, is to look at the terms and conditions and the exhibits for prior grant agreements. And we do have posted on the website, the PIDP grants website, information on the 2020 grant agreements and terms and conditions that an applicant should verify that the manner in which they've procured, in this case, the professional services, complies with the provisions that are in those documents. I will tell you from experience that very often that is not the case. But it's worth, if an applicant wants to consider that engineering or geotechnical entity as part of this, the post-award expenses that we discussed, you need to make sure that the selection process has followed the guidance that's in those terms and conditions documents.
Okay, and then we have one more question, at least so far. So the last one is saying that this potential applicant knows they need to do they will need a NEPA categorical Cat X, I think you'll know what that means, Peter, and some final design, procurement, etc. before construction. Would obligation occur only upon a NEPA record of decision? Is that the main determination of ripeness for obligation?
Right, so this is a NEPA categorical exclusion, and this is kind of one of the circumstances where we would definitely recommend the applicant reach out to our Office of Environmental Compliance. Our office will do an independent assessment of the NEPA documentation that an applicant has, and it's not always the case that an applicant has all of the necessary NEPA documentation in place. One frequent example is that they might have received clearance under, let's say, the Corps of Engineers under NEPA for a component of the project, but that NEPA does not, that was issued by the Corps of Engineers, does not cover the full footprint of the project proposed for Port Infrastructure Development Program funding. So in this particular case, and again with environmental questions, strongly recommend that an applicant reach out to our Office of Environmental Compliance to get specific assistance regarding questions like this.
Well, thanks, Peter. That's all of the questions we've received so far. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Nope. Thank you again for your time this afternoon. We look forward to a robust slate of applications. If you have additional questions, you can always send them to pidpgrants@dot.gov. We are getting a lot of questions, and so bear with us as we answer them. We try to answer them in the order that's received. And then the final reminder that applications, again, will be due May 16th, midnight, Eastern time, May 16th.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everyone, for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day.